Philip Kiszely, welcome to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks very much, John. It's really great to be here, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you.
Likewise. It was a pleasure when you accepted my invitation. You've done some pretty big-hitting podcasts like Andrew Dole's Heretics, and of course you are a fellow at the New Culture Forum, which is a heavy hitter in its own right. So when you agreed to come on, I knew I was going to have a great conversation. Really grateful for you to be here. And a bit of background about you. You are a cultural historian by trade, and you're an academic at the University of Leeds up until very recently. Perhaps before we get into talking about what you know about British cultural history and its ebbs and flows and how it's been presented in popular culture, maybe we start off with what does a day in the life of a cultural historian look like, and what was it in particular that you were focused on?
Well, I've always been interested in post-war culture. Okay, so stuff from post-1945. I'm interested in 20th century primarily. I'm interested in 18th century. I'm interested in all cultural history. But the post-war stuff, the road, I suppose, from 1945 to where we are today, which is this incredible kind of moving road, and we're going through all sorts of realignments and changes, but as we speak at the moment, and we might get into that. But I suppose it's just that modern era. So I'm really interested in popular culture in particular, and I suppose the technological developments from that time. So the emergence, for example, of the 7-inch single, which I think is really important actually in terms of youth culture. The development of the LP. I'm also interested very much in the development of television, because again, that's hugely, massively important in terms of communication and ideas, as well as entertainment, and film, of course, as well. So all of those things together, and literature. I'm a huge 60s and 70s literature buff. So I like that sense of trying to understand some of those pivotal moments that take us to where we are now. And I suppose a day in the life, at the moment, there's lots of media stuff and podcasts and going up and I'm here in Yorkshire, so it's up and down to London quite a lot. But doing lots of stuff from home because technology allows us to do that now. Writing, and feeding my little cat over there. So hopefully he won't make too much of an appearance on this podcast.
I don't know about that. I mean, cat videos do very well on YouTube. We would do well out of a cat appearance. So, drop a few biscuits.
Well, he's asleep at the moment, so he's okay. But I suppose it's just it's making culture a career. And I've taught for 25 years. I've been in higher education. I've seen huge changes there as well, both in terms of the research culture, but also in terms of the pedagogical culture, the teaching culture. And we're cursed to live in a very interesting time. And my life, because I'm involved in all of that stuff, has been pretty interesting in the recent past.
Well, we should definitely unpack some of these turning points you've seen within British pop culture. We should also unpack a little bit about what you've seen in the university setting with regards to teaching style and content, and perhaps even profile of student. But let's dig into British media. A couple of weeks ago, this was before a very, very good friend of mine, he'll be the best man at my wedding, knew that you were coming on and that we were going to be getting into this kind of thing. He obviously knows what I'm into, and he sent me a video, and it was a clip of a news presenter back in the late 90s. It probably wasn't long after Blair had taken power, and it was a whole segment on the 10 o'clock news talking about Tomb Raider, which had just come out, and it was one of these big releases in the gaming industry, which was the slickest looking thing you could see, and it was unashamedly pro-British in its sentiments. There was all sorts of talk about us being a leading centre, look at this ingenuity, insinuating that you couldn't find it anywhere else. And effectively, it was just one big pro-British plug. And he said when he watched it, he just couldn't believe it was the same country, that it was so bizarre to see. And I believe it might have been, I couldn't remember, it was either BBC or Channel 4. And he couldn't actually believe that the sentiments being pushed were the same organisations. So perhaps we can delve into how media has portrayed aspects of British life as it developed throughout the 20th century. Was there ever a point where it was pro-British and then it started to drop a bit as we perhaps looked in on ourselves and lost a bit of confidence? Did it go up again? And when was it that it dipped again? What does it look like, Philip?
I think there have always been elements of anti-Britishness, and there's always been a communist party that's always worked to varying extents of success. Probably not so much after, say, Hungary in 1956, but up until then, that was kind of a major thing. But even then, even if you think about the new left after the war, for example, the Marxist left, they weren't that anti-British. Okay, certainly not by comparison. Yeah. So I think something's happened, and I think you probably have to go back to education to really understand it. So we used to have an historical education that was essentially, on the one hand, it was economic history, and on the other hand, it was political history. So if you did GCSEs or O levels before that, or A levels or whatever, then you'd have those two strands of history, and somewhere in between, you'd gain a social understanding between those two things. Okay, what was taught generally was a sense of grand narrative. Okay, these are the things that have happened, and often those things that had happened were achievements. Yeah, and that sense of how those achievements knotted together was the story of Britain, in a way, because in lots of ways, Britain is a story of achievement. You could then map those things onto the broader picture, which was Western culture. And it wasn't all, wine and roses and aren't we brilliant and everything's wonderful, as people would have you believe now. Okay, it really wasn't like that. So there would be the tragedy of the First World War. There would be, real critical engagement. There would be all sorts of, what's happened and why, and how can we avoid that kind of thing again, the lessons of history. But it was generally a grand narrative with Britain at the center of it. Then certainly by the middle to late 60s and into the 70s, and my God, very much into the 80s, this is earlier than most people think, we were seeing a sense of deconstruction, right? And this idea that, okay, let's not think about the grand narrative. Let's think about what we might call micro narratives, okay? And let's think about particular groups of people and particular things. And this idea of the postmodern really burgeons and becomes massive, certainly by the beginning of this century. Now, there's nothing wrong with looking at detail, okay? And there's nothing wrong with being critical. And there's nothing wrong with looking at micro narratives. You need to do that. History is themed. You need to do that. But if what you do is look at only the micro narratives, only the interest groups, and you remove them from context, absolutely, because you don't really believe in context. The only way you will think about context or use it is as a weapon. Yeah. Then things begin to unravel very, very quickly, and you can pretty much say what you want. So this postmodern micro-narrative approach to history gets a set of agendas become very, very kind of prominent, and we know what they are, right? So they're obviously race, okay, their gender and their sexuality, and latterly they are things like the environment and mental health. But those things are essentially framed as anti-British. They don't need to be, but they're framed as anti-British. They are a way of they are tools for decolonization. They are tools of anti-Westernness. And somehow they have completely supplanted, they have completely we've thrown away that grand narrative. And in its place, we've got this set of micro narratives that do relate to each other, but relate to each other in ways that are fundamentally anti-British and anti-Western. And I think all of that stuff has then gone into media for very, very obvious reasons. Well, technology is a massive reason why, okay, because we're using technology now. We can get to potentially a huge audience here, okay, and we couldn't have done this 20 or 30 years ago, right? Social media is the driver there. But also because people are now of age and have been for a long time who know no different, okay? Talked about education before. I've very regularly come across students in several institutions that I've worked in. I'm not going to mention any institutions in this podcast, but several institutions that I've worked in who couldn't give you the dates of the Second World War, for example. Okay, now that's not because they're stupid or they've got a low IQ or anything like that. It's just they've never been told, right? They've never been told. So there's a sense that media is going to reflect all of that stuff because media is a product of all of that stuff. Yeah. And if you look at we're talking about comedy in particular. I was talking about comedy the other day. There is just no comedy now, right? And if you compare the comedy today, which is basically someone pointing a finger at you and telling you either how terrible you are because you're white and male, or how brilliant you are because you're of color and trans, and how terrible Britain is. That's comedy today. If you compare it to comedy of only 20 years ago, it's hugely different. So the change, while it's been a long time coming, has also happened very quickly.
It absolutely has. When you brought up comedy, it brought me straight to a conversation that I've had repeatedly with my fiance. And I don't watch a lot of television, so when I say yeah, okay, let's watch some television, I have started to insist that we watch reruns from a pre-social media era and potentially even pre-noughties, but certainly pre-social media. And a great example was we watched Blackadder together, the Rowan Atkinson series, which started in the 80s. And that is certainly no voice box for the establishment. In fact, it is an anti-establishment program, but it gently lampoons our institutions and key figures. And it doesn't do so in a political way. It mocks the idea of backwardness in many respects and the abuse of power, but in an incredibly typically British funny way. You can see the whole national character in there. And whilst I didn't find the next Rowan Atkinson series anywhere near as funny, my fiance loved it, but there's a few parts that were amusing. The Thin Blue Line is another example, and that they'd brought a Muslim police officer in, and she showed her hair, she wore skirts, she was proud about she's open about her sexuality, her heterosexuality. And what was amusing was even when there was slight references to the culture she was from, it wasn't in any kind of hectoring way. And this was mid-90s. And as you have alluded to, you effectively can't turn on the television now without a really obvious moral lecture taking place. And it makes it unwatchable. So I just think it's best not to watch anything pre-social media, because that's when it all just goes off a cliff, in my opinion.
Do you know, one of the times that it's a few years ago now, and I think it was the BBC, and they did a version of A Christmas Carol, and it was about 2019, and it had everything in it. Scrooge was, a capitalist, and there were allusions to the NHS, and it actually said for the many and not the few. Actually used that phrase in the show, which was for viewers, that was the Labour, the Labour tagline, the Jeremy Corbyn tagline, for the many and not the few, and it was just like had been produced in a really bad undergraduate script writing workshop, and it had every single cliche you could think of, every single cliche in the book, right? And I thought, my God, things can't get any worse than this. Little did I know. Now I'm like you, I can't watch anything. I never watch the BBC. I never watch ITV. Thank God I never watch Channel 4. I don't watch any of it. I only watch heritage channels. Like Talking Pictures, I'll give it a plug. Talking Pictures TV, which is just absolutely excellent in every single way, because the modern stuff is just completely unwatchable. But here's the thing: I hardly know anybody who watches it. Maybe that's because I move in particular circles. You could say, "Oh, well, you're you, and you do all of this kind of stuff." But I know people who vehemently disagree with me in terms of politics, but they agree totally in terms of the culture, in terms of the education, in terms of the entertainment culture. And that's really sad, right? Because I think of young people in particular, and I think of when I was young and how I adored some things. I absolutely adore. I remember growing up in Manchester when I was a teenager in the 1980s, and it was all happening in Manchester. Okay. And I had the Smiths, for example, in Manchester, Morrissey and the Smiths, and I adored them. I absolutely adored them. They were my band. They were on the doorstep, and they were just brilliant, But I also loved things like the Stones, and I loved stuff from the 60s as well. And all of that stuff, which was in a way mine, I don't see people relating to popular culture, young people relating to popular culture in the same way now. They only relate to it, or it seems to me, with a kind of ironic distance with modern pop culture. And that's a shame, because there's no passion there. And it's awful. It's a real shame. And I think that's the difference between then and now.
Pop music, that's a good point you made. And before we started recording, you had alluded to, and then when we started recording, you mentioned that you thought that the launch of the 7-inch single was a huge moment in cultural history. And I remember growing up, you would listen to albums front to back. And I was growing up, I suppose, in the era that Oasis were popular. I was still a little bit young, but I was aware of them, and I knew Oasis and Blur were battling it out to be the best of British, as it were. In that era of cool Britannia that the Blair government had ushered in the media's eyes. And what's really funny now is knowing that when people hold on to any kind of music now, it's always from the 60s onwards. But here in this country, the Oasis tickets and everything that went on with those, the crazy amount of demand for people trying to get these tickets, and then they ended up doubling the number of shows to meet the demand. Oasis were around well before social media, before all of our attentions got fried, before we just had streaming services where we'd listen to the odd song all disconnected from one another. And also in an era where you have songs effectively made to juice your hormones, faster bass lines, lots of heavy drums, auto-tune voice, potentially aggressive or really sexual lyrics. And people don't listen to them in a storybook anymore, but that's what albums were made for. And they would go through lots of ups and downs. They'd get your heart racing, they'd bring you into melancholy, and it was around someone's life or a period. And now it's just, what can we do it's like the chasing the clicks, isn't it? And I think it's remarkable just how much things have changed in the music scene, and how clearly whatever music has been produced post noughties just doesn't seem to be anywhere near as popular, and it lasts for about a second and everyone's forgotten who made it.
It lasts for a second, then it goes. You got the idea of the album, the 12-inch album, which is big enough to have great artwork on it, okay, and a collection of curated collection of songs, which might have an overarching theme, but which might not, but belong together. And this has been overplayed, hasn't it? The thing about vinyl and how everybody loves vinyl and stuff like that. But the idea of taking out, putting it on, sitting down and listen to it. I don't think many people do that anymore. But that sense of listen, it's almost like you would sit down and listen to a symphony. It's like the popular music version of that. And then you talk about Oasis, and I was there in Manchester. I was in a band in Manchester doing retro rock and roll in the early 90s, and it got to about 1993, and I thought we're never going to make it, because it was all dance music and electronic music and stuff like that. And so around about the end of 1993, I just said, enough. I'm going to go to university. I'm worried about my future. No one's going to buy kind of a band that's making retro rock and roll. Okay, cue 6 months later, I walk into into my flat, and there's the television, and there's Noel on the television. Who used to play at the Boardwalk where they had the residency. We played the In the City that they played. where they were very, you should see them around also. And it's like, oh my god, they were the biggest thing to hit Britain since the bubonic plague. And I'd left the building Elvis style 6 months earlier, right? But it wasn't just the music. It was, they were funny, right? They were a representation of class and place. And they didn't care. They were the last massive band who any idiot can not care and be outrageous and not be successful, right? Any idiot can do that. But to have the kind of success that they had, and genuinely not care. I can't remember which way. It might be, some might say, I can't remember which single it is. There's no video to it because Liam didn't turn up one day because he was disgraced, and so they never made a video, and ended up in one shot. It was that kind of thing. It was like the Sex Pistols, or it was like the Stones, and it was classic, massive, but totally kind of anarchic in a way. There was something about that era. It was almost, we didn't know how things were going to change, but it was almost a last hurrah of hedonism for me, right? Because I was very much part of it. My God, I was hedonistic in those days. I was only in my 20s, and it felt like the end of something, and of course it was. It was the end of something. So I think into the new century, a few years into the new century, things started changing, and Britain became a very different place. But that, looking back, a lot of that stuff was fresh and new, but it was also looking back, and it was celebrating a kind of heritage, right? They were celebrating Beatles, obviously. Yeah. Now we've got a very different relationship with our cultural past. Okay, to get back to the point, me talking about Manchester, if you're talking about Manchester or Zara, we have a very different relationship with our cultural heritage now. It deconstructs, it criticizes, it pulls apart, it's ironic, there's a distance there. interestingly enough, we don't have that distance. We have utter naivety when it comes to any other culture outside of the Anglosphere in the West. Yeah. That's the difference between then and now. We were used to celebrate all of those cultures, but primarily we celebrated our own. Now we rubbish our own, and we very naively celebrate everything. You'll see students on campus openly celebrating Hamas, for example, saying that, oh, well, they are the oppressed, and the West are oppressors, or the Israelis are oppressors. So in a way, a very, very stupid mindset, but it's all connected.
Certainly is. And having spent quite some time in the corporate world since I got into it, I've been working for 20 years or something after being an early school leaver, did a stint in retail and sales, and I was front of house. I didn't really see a lot of the social stuff going on in the background, but having spent time around the financial services ecosystem in the last 13 years, which is chock full of graduates, those who came after the Blair reforms that turned the universities into a hive for paying customers nationally, internationally, and no one wants to fail their customers, and we want to give customers what they want, and we can not challenge them and all of those things, but also allow them to effectively create their own syllabuses in some respects. You could make an argument that many of these social sciences and the various lenses that have been applied are the consequence of allowing a kind of self-gratifying selection of content. And obviously most people who get into academia will be inclined towards that left bias just because of the numbers of them. But working in the financial services environment, I see the celebration of cultures very openly, and the diminishing, or at least the suppressing of the host culture of Britain. Give two examples. So most recent one is seeing Christmas parties not being called Christmas parties anymore. They're winter parties, which is soul destroying. You don't need to be a Christian to recognize that just because the company might be full of people from all different places, it doesn't actually reside inside of an airport terminal where there is no law of the land there. There's no taxes, there's no duty, whatever. There is a very real place and people around here, and this is what has been celebrated for 1600 years. It seems a little bit self-indulgent, and at least, and I suppose at worst, a bit imposing, to suggest we can just wipe that away. And I've also seen there be flexibility added to people's holiday allowance so that they can choose not to take Christmas Day, Boxing Day, Easter Sunday, or Easter Monday, Good Friday. They can just take them any other time in the year. Just you choose. It's all about flexibility, as though a corporation can decide that as to what a country decides. And the final point I'll make is Easter. Now, you don't see Easter talked about in the corporate world anymore. It runs alongside Ramadan, and Ramadan is promoted, and often you'll find leaders of very large corporations doing lots of social media, talking about how they're fasting. Too Fast, Too Furious is a hashtag that I saw. Them breaking iftar at the end of the day, taking pictures of themselves, doing bios, encouraging other non-Muslims to do it, without actually realizing that, culture isn't just made up on the spot, and religious ideas and are theological, and they mean something to the people espousing them. And in the case of Ramadan, it's the acceptance that the Quran is the final word, and that everything goes into that. And for these corporate leaders, it's just a way of showing their bona fides with regards to, look how inclusive we are. There are no ramifications to them, but for many people, there are huge ramifications. And I don't know when this ends, if it ever does, but I think it's having such deleterious effects on cohesion.
Yeah, I think there are a few things to say about that. And as you were telling me those stories, which are very familiar to me, you know, working in the education sector, a few things kind of suggest themselves. That idea that we have to celebrate every other culture than our own, apart from our own, is actually a really patronizing, paternalistic idea, isn't it? You know, oh well, we know we can take all of that. We're very mature, you know. But you must enjoy your culture. We'll look on and like, you know, like loving parents to the to the childish cultures. It's just, it always strikes me as really patronizing, because it's hugely patronizing. You know, it's taking, you know, being the parent, taking yourself out of it and letting these children play. Let the children play. Related to that is the growing sense that we fetishize youth as well. And you were talking about syllabuses or syllabi. I'm not quite sure what it was. I should actually, after 25 years in the sector. Where you know, it's student led, and young people know best, and it's a lived experience. It's their lived experience. There's something that happened in the culture about 20-25 years ago, in which we somehow jettisoned experience. We stopped venerating age and experience, and all of those things that have guided us for millennia, right? And we started kind of putting youth on a pedestal, and it's almost like saying, right, you don't know anything, you've got no experience whatsoever, you are by definition shallow because you're young. Okay, we'll take a lead from you. That'll be great, won't it? And you see it with, you know, various cultural figures, and the obvious one that I'm thinking about, of course, is Greta Thunberg. Yeah. So it's that sense of, if we're kind of trying to think about where this stuff comes from, it's actually quite complicated because it brings in all of these other things. But the thing about youth is that they tend to be shallowly idealistic, and they tend to veer towards radical left-wing politics because they've not been kicked about by life yet. And so in a way, that's one explanation of how we're going left and left and left and left and left and left. I think it was Douglas Murray who said, or Jordan Peterson, I can't remember which one, who said, you know, we can go left and left and left and left, but we never get to the gulag. Whereas, you know, you talk about mention reducing taxes once, and you're a far right fascist and God knows what, you know. So there's a sense that things are at play which we're taking away the things that have guided us in the past. And in a way, I don't want to get too dark, but that's really frightening. And part of British culture is that Burkean thing of thinking about the contract between generations, the past, present, and future, and that idea of conserving something of the culture and conserving something of the way we do things. That stuff is being pushed away. We see it in the culture. We don't see the references to the past that we used to have. It's all new. The references are around the new religion of gender and race and sexuality. That's the whole thing. You know, it's the year zero mentality. Now that's fundamentally un-British, right? We've never done things like that. There have been elements of that in the culture, but they've never been dominant. Even in the 70s with the socialist experiment, there was still something really British about where we are. Now you can say, well, what's the reason for that? One of the obvious reasons for that is mass immigration. We had 1.2 million people coming to the country last year. Okay, that's going to change things massively, and that extremely quick, accelerated change is also part of what's going on. But we're not getting that sense of hang on, let's just put the brakes on a little bit. It's more putting your head down and running towards the brick wall as quickly as you can. And for me, that's the frightening thing. That's what we see in culture, but that's what we're seeing in politics and society as well.
I think you're right. I suppose I probably betrayed my leanings long ago in this conversation, so it probably doesn't come as any surprise to me to say that the notion that we're knocking away the supports of what the country was built upon, and not in an intentional top-down way, but an organically developed way over many centuries. A couple of examples hit the news recently. Number one, in the home of our national church, Canterbury, I think the Christ Church University has just removed English literature as a course to study because there's not enough take up. This is also where the very famous Chaucer's Canterbury Tales was written about, and as a pillar, a cornerstone of national culture. But as you were talking, you reminded me of a conversation I had with one of your colleagues very early on in the podcast, and he's over in the business school. And I got him on because he was talking about the need to inculcate an epistemic humility, which is for most ears a sense of you don't know it all. And he particularly was focused on business students like MBAs because, if anyone's worked with an MBA, they can be pretty cocksure when it comes to how a business should be run, but they might not see the bigger picture. And I thought, well, that's an interesting concept. And what I also found interesting, though, was that it was being applied in a way that was not particularly humble, insofar as the ideas to inculcate humility were getting them to focus on the solving of global goals like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which to me seems like an incredibly a hubristic thing to think about, the idea that you can just go across the world, you've got this one take-off-the-shelf goal, which you're going to apply to any geography and people, and that's going to be a success. I don't think that breeds humility, but the reason why I bring that up is in that conversation, I said to him, what you're doing there, there's a noble goal for sure, but where has it been lost in universities to try to bring about the next generation of torch carriers? And I brought up the example of the film Chariots of Fire, which was about the famous runner from Edinburgh, from the Highlands of Scotland, called Eric Liddell, all that famous music. And in there was a Jewish man called Howard Abrams, and he was a bit of a renegade type. And there was a scene with the Cambridge Dons, and the Cambridge Dons are bringing them in on their inset day, or whatever it's called, and said that the role of us at Cambridge is not just to develop a student, we're here to create an Englishman. And that's gone. It's gone, as I know people like Connor Tomlinson put it, we are now just a free economic zone for all of the world, and so we're like a big duty-free lounge. And this sense of not trying to pass anything on, not trying to develop the character and to pass that on, whether it's through literature, whether it's through character formation, we don't even talk about that anymore. It's about GDP and things that contribute to STEM.
Yeah, I mean, as far as education is concerned, which you started talking about Canterbury there, these courses are being closed down because the model doesn't serve them, right? Every university prides itself on being global, international, all of those things, and every traditional subject is at the mercy of the decolonizers, for example. And it's also at the mercy of theory. So the idea that you can go through an English literature degree without really reading, more than a handful of novels, but you spend all your time reading feminist theory or post-colonialist theory or gender theory or Judith Butler or whatever it is. You can either read all of those stuff and not really read any novels. You don't really have to. That is very sad, and it negate. What am I trying to say here? Because I just want to be a bit careful. There's a sense that the arts, social sciences, and humanities, I think, are in such trouble. I can't really see them existing in universities in 10 years' time in the way they exist at the moment, right? Because they're completely interchangeable. If you're reading history, all you're going to learn about is post-colonialism and feminism. If you're reading drama, then you're going to read exactly the same thing. It's a sausage machine in which people are just coming out with exactly the same ideas. It used to be about free thinking. It used to be about engaging with texts. Now it's applying a set of pre-cooked ideas to texts, or not, as the case may be. You might not bother with the text. You just engage with the ideas on a very shallow level, because they're actually quite shallow ideas. Excuse me, that's one thing. The other thing is the market. Okay, so domestic students, English students from Britain don't bring in that much money. Okay, so universities tend to focus on international students, right? But what happens is they don't get international students in great numbers. What they tend to get is Chinese students in great numbers, right? So our students our universities are becoming Chinese finishing schools. You take any university and the MA students there, if it's a good university, the vast number of MA students there are going to be Chinese, okay? Because they pay a fortune to come under it, and they want to come. Now, the Chinese students are lovely. They're really, really nice. They're fantastic, people. But the courses are being geared towards Chinese students. And something really weird is happening in higher education. You've got the Chinese Communist Party, one of the most brutal dictatorships in the world. And we are educating their children. And we're not educating our own children, because they're not going to university in the numbers that they did, or they're going abroad, or something else is happening. And that's happening especially in the arts, social sciences, and humanities. So we're not educating Englishmen, we're educating Chinese kids, And again, I'd reiterate and say, certainly in various institutions, the Chinese kids, they're fantastic. They're wonderful kids, but we need to educate English people.
Yeah, well, there are lots of people talking about that mismatch between entrance requirements, whether you're foreign or national, huge disparities, and obviously much lower barriers to entry for foreign students who pay 3 times the amount. I wonder if we start to try and pin the moment things started to change. So you joined academia back in 1999 before you left this year. So 25 years, and that's a couple of years after Blair, who we've talked about, and he brought those great reforms in. But it was also the point in which students had to start paying to go to university. And did you? What was the profile of student and approach to education like then? And do you think, looking back, that if there were any remnants of the old order there, 2 years into the Blair premiership, do you think that was ultimately what set us off down this track of all of these social sciences, the deconstructionism being rolled out on a big scale, and then ultimately creating the people who ended up populating our media institutions and all of our other institutions of influence? Was that the critical moment, or is that much of a simplistic view?
No, I think there's something in it. I'm not going to talk about particular institutions. Just talk generally about the sector, but I think there is something in it. I felt reasonably comfortable in the sector up until about 2012. Okay. I felt as though I had a future. I was a bit different in the sense that I wasn't radically left wing or anything like that. But I was certainly a libertarian, and there was a sense of libertarianness about education. It was free thinking to a certain extent. It was still a marketplace of ideas. Okay. I think that the Blair thing of getting, what was it, 50% of people to university or whenever it was, or really upping universities, the post-92s getting, it was before Blair, but the post-92s turning the polytechnics, which previously had worked very well as vocational education institutions, into research-driven kind of on the coattails of the Russell Group and the Red Bricks. I think that was catastrophic. I think throwing so many people into an education system that just couldn't cope with them, because you just can't have so many people in an elite education institute, education system that's supposed to be educated the best, right? I think what happened was that everything dumbed down massively. So you weren't dealing with small numbers anymore and trying to get the best out of an intellectual elite. That kind of, that whole approach changed. So you were just dealing with large groups of people and herding them through. Because as you said before, they were customers. What the customers tended to do was say, well, why aren't you getting me through with a 2-1? Your teaching isn't that good because you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. I'm a customer, so I want a first or a 2-1. And at that time, what you began to see was an inflation of grades. And I remember one year in an institution when I first started teaching, I was flabbergasted at the number of firsts that came out, and I was flabbergasted at who was getting the firsts. That was the change. These customers almost to pay for these degrees, and they were coming out. It was quite depressing to see, but it was round about, as I say, 2012, 2013, 2014, when that again changed into something else, right? And it was this idea that if you don't agree with me, or you don't have a particular set of ideas which are the accepted set of ideas, you're a pariah, right? Now, education has always been left-wing, and it's always been a bit crazy and all of that kind of thing, but not in that way. It became quite an uncomfortable place for someone like me, right? Then that became more and more marked. So this sense of the good people, we are defined by our politics and what we think and our way of life. And there was a real amount of snobbery to it as well, cultural snobbery, huge amount of cultural snobbery. That became more and more intense. So by about 2019 or 2020, when you had BLM, then you had lockdown, then you had trans, and now you've got Hamas. All of these people kind of coalesce around these things. And it's, as I said before, it's this kind of oppressed versus oppressors. And if you're not on the side of the oppressed, then somehow you need to be gotten rid of. You need to go away because you're harmful. Okay. Irrespective of actually what the evidence is, what the historical evidence is, or what the empirical evidence is. So that kind of burgeoned and burgeoned and burgeoned. I'm talking about education there, but I think you've talked about your experience in the corporate world. I think you can map that onto the corporate world quite easily. Yeah. I think you could absolutely map it on to the media world, without any doubt. But you've also got things like the civil service, and you've also got things like the Church of England now, actually not dealing in Christianity anymore, but dealing in this new religion, dealing in this kind of cult-like obsession with gender and race and reparations and the environment as well. So all of this stuff, it's a changing of the goal. It feels like we've been in a kind of liminal space for the last few years, moving from one metaphysics to another, one way of being to another way of being, and that shift is going ever faster, and some of us are really fighting against it, and not many people want it, but it seems to be happening anyway. We're going from one age to another age. In other words, the 21st century is kicking in, and I'm looking from my age of 53, and I'm looking at the rest of the century, and I'm thinking, my God, I'm glad I won't be here for most of it.
You're not the first person to say that to me, that's for sure. You will know, being in the history game, that a cliche almost is that history is written by the winners. So the answer to this question, if that cliche holds true in any way, I suppose is going to be tainted by who it is that might be the winners. And so let's start thinking about what a cultural historian of the future might look back and say on this period. And I suppose we could potentially argue that we're undergoing a vibe shift away from that liminal space you just talked about, the uber progressivism, if that's one way of referring to it. Though it seems a little bit regressive, to say the least, but let's stick with progressive. We've got the Trump victory, which seems to be emanating out this feeling that the administrative state and the various institutions that have all been pushing a lot of the ideas we've been talking about may well be on its last legs. And obviously, with that being the de facto center of our Anglosphere's empire, as it were, we tend to be downstream of those things. So perhaps your answer will be influenced by that, and maybe we do see something looking back in a different way. But how do you think a cultural historian would view the period which you've studied, so from the 60s up until now, and all of the ideological and demographic shifts in the context of British history? What do you think they would say?
They'd probably call it Goodbye Britain. If you were writing a book about that, you'd say, cheerio Britain, goodbye Britain. I go through periods of fairly intense depression about it all, for all of the reasons I've just said. Actually, it's because it seems like we've got our heads down and we're running towards a brick wall. We're not going to stop, and the only way it seems as though things are going to change is after the catastrophe. In a way, that's what we do, isn't it? We see this in Europe now with the countries like Sweden and Denmark are saying, well, enough is enough. In Italy, enough is enough with unfettered immigration, because things have changed so quickly, and there are so many people that we just cannot assimilate. We're going to have to do something about it after the catastrophe's happened. What we're not very good at, especially in this country, is averting the catastrophe, and not running into the brick wall. Having said that, so if I carry on with that imagery, then the historian of the future is going to say, well, things just collapsed, and that was the end. That was the end of Britain, or that was the end of Britain for a time, and now it maybe things are beginning to get better, but there was a catastrophe. The Trump thing was extraordinary, I think. I was on I did a New Culture Forum podcast every week. We record it on the Thursday, or either the Thursday or the Wednesday, and it goes out on the Saturday. And we all called it, right? There were four of us: Peter Whittle, Rafe Hadelman-Q, Amy Gallagher and myself, and we all called it, right? We all said, well, Trump's going to win. Yeah. And the podcast with Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart definitely didn't call it. Okay. We called it because there are obvious signs that people are fed up with what's going on, fed up with the mental health crisis that is extreme left-wing seeking, which has now become the mainstream. Okay. And we see the mental health crisis in the Trump derangement syndrome, the meltdowns of what's happening. You've seen it on Twitter, the liberals going absolutely berserk because Trump's won. People are looking at that and they are thinking, well, one, we're sick of it. We're fed up of it. But two, we don't want it for our children and our grandchildren, right? And you mentioned Connor Tomlinson before. I think there's a new breed of young, tough, often male, actually, very turned on, very intelligent, political people, not just commentators, but people who are very definitely pushing back on this in terms of lifestyle, but also in terms of ideas, all the rest of it. So I'm seeing glimmers of hope, and I think the Trump thing is much more than a glimmer of hope. It was huge. It was a landslide in American terms. It was enormous. It was a complete negation of all of those things. Now, if some of that can come our way, even if it's only some of that, then we might be looking at a much rosier picture than we think we're seeing at the moment. That said, and I'm really kind of, I'm not very one way or the other here, right? But that said, I'm still looking at anti-Semitic hate marches every Saturday in big cities like Leeds and London and Manchester. Okay, I'm still seeing that kind of worrying, very alien to us, anti-Britishness, which we've already talked about, but which seems to be growing and growing. I suppose demographics is part of that. So I'm very worried that mindset is just going to be more entrenched and grow and grow and grow. But at least we're beginning to fight back against it. And we got 5 reform. Is it 5? We've got 5 reform MPs, haven't we? And we were talking about reform before. That is a good sign, but reform are by no means perfect. Okay, but there are other parties like the SDP which I wish people would know more about. Okay, there is an alternative. There is a sense of fight back. It is sensible. It is really sensible. And I think people are really crying out for something that makes sense, something that isn't lived experience of I feel like a woman today, therefore I am a woman today, even though I've got a beard, right? That kind of thing. So I think there is a fight back. The question is how successful is that going to be? I still think we've got to have much more crisis, much more fear. We've got to be collectively frightened that we are going to lose something before things get better. But, and I have to say this because I need something to cling to, I think things will get better.
I think you might be right, only because in my own circles and those in my concentric circles who would have typically, I think, not found themselves around this type of conversation before, are starting to have them in some way. And the sense of loss you were talking about needing to be felt deep within the psyche before there's perhaps a decisive shift in the opposite direction, whatever that may look like. I do think it's starting to happen partly because security is clearly becoming a watchword, and we've just had the Remembrance Sunday weekend, and indeed we're recording today on Armistice Day. And I went to a service on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh. I live in Edinburgh at the moment, and potentially we'll move back to the glorious lands of England next year, but for the time being, resident in Edinburgh. And the service was lovely. There was an orchestra with a brass band. It was all the military processing down from the castle, and a real sense of occasion, very solemn. The national anthem was going. South Africa was in town for the rugby. They were all wearing their poppies. It felt like the Commonwealth in arms, like people could recognize that actually we are cousins. They're not just a random nation. And so there was a sense of solidarity, at least amongst the core, but it was tempered quite badly by there being a few shifty characters in the crowd, which startled a few of the people that I was with, and they didn't want to stand near the crowd. They wanted to get away because they were afraid that something bad was going to happen. And it was that moment where we'd gone to celebrate in some way the fact that we were all together, remembering the sacrifices made to keep whatever civilization and whatever fumes of civilization they were fighting for alive so we could enjoy them. And it was totally put in the shadows by the insecurity felt. And it was that moment, that realization for people who usually want to avoid this conversation, who now know we live in a low trust society and it was never that way. And I think once that gets into people's heads, fear is a big driver. And you can see it in the political commentary, even amongst the liberal commentariat. You can find it amongst the Matthew Syeds of the Times talking about ending identity politics, stop trashing European culture and celebrate it, stop mass immigration. This is pure centrist area, and it's becoming more and more. So I think I've been like you. I've been heavily depressed about the trajectory of my country. I used to be one of these dyed-in-the-wool progressive types. In fact, when I got my first job in financial services, because I'd read a bit of Noam Chomsky and some Che Guevara, I decided that I should get to the top of the system and bring it all down. I didn't really know anything about my history either, and it wasn't much later on until I started to feel rootless, and I got into it and realized that actually we aren't just a malign force in the world, that everything changed. And particularly as I saw things changing around me in the cities, and I thought, I don't like this at all. So I think that seems to be coming now to a much wider purview of people than I don't think we would have expected. And I suppose we'll see how it develops. Philip, I've kept you long enough, but there's one question that I ask all of my guests when they come on, which is, what have you changed your mind on in the course of your life that perhaps you once held to be concretely true? And what was it that made you think differently?
You see, I don't think I've changed. You've actually just described in yourself a kind of journey that I think many people of your age are having because they're having to have it, right? That change has been thrust upon you because you're seeing everything around. Okay, I'm old enough to have seen stuff that was going on. I remember the 80s very well. My God, I even remember right at the end of the 70s. But the beginnings of mass immigration, the kind of mass immigration that we know today. I mean, and I have to say, I'm from an immigrant background myself. My father came here in 1959. I'm not wholly against immigration. You know what I mean? I'm against mass immigration. Very much so, because I think it's the thing that we are up against. The thing is with me, the point I'm trying to make is that I always was, right? I could see it. I could see the potential problems ahead, the fracturing of society, the kind of, certainly I lived in a Jewish area of North Manchester. I could see the potential threat to Jews. I could see all of that stuff. It was crystal clear to me 30 years ago. This is why it's so frustrating thinking about seeing about all of this stuff and thinking, could you not see it 30 years ago? So I don't think I've changed I've not changed fundamentally or philosophically. I've pretty much always been a small c conservative, even though I've been involved in culture and music and nightclubbing and youth culture and stuff. I'd certainly been involved in that when I was younger, and I've been involved in culture all of my life. It tends to be leftist, all of that. I never was that, but I'm open-minded. So I felt, I often felt quite. The thing that I've changed my mind on, it's not a big thing, but in some ways it is. So I was never that bothered about monarchy before. I wasn't particularly against it, but I never thought it was, I never really thought about it that much. It's only in the last 10 years or so that I appreciate how actually important the monarchy is, one, to the British identity, but two, to the British way of life as well. That idea of having a family as a focal point, the idea that they represent some kind of continuity, even though it's very tenuous and it's very fragile at the moment. And being a monarchist doesn't necessarily mean you have to love the particular royal family.
Yeah.
But I feel that in terms of success, monarchies kind of work. You look at the countries that have monarchies and they tend to be reasonably okay and reasonably stable. So that has been something which has been almost a final piece in the puzzle that has helped me understand, I think, what is important about the British identity and way of life. It's something that is different to everywhere else. It's like the common law in a way, it's peculiar to us. And there's something that, because our monarchy, our constitutional monarchy is kind of unique, then it's something that we should hold, even though there are problems with the individuals involved. It's something that we should hold to us. I don't think I'd ever thought that through before because I was too busy doing other things. But for me, that's something that is important. I could say one more thing, actually, which is very current. And
Please do.
if you were to ask me about Donald Trump in 2016, I was saying this before we started recording, wasn't it? If you asked me to say about Donald Trump for 2016, I was going, oh, well, yeah, right, yeah. Now I've changed my mind. I think Donald Trump is. I wasn't anti-Trump, but I wasn't particularly pro-Trump. Now I'm pro-Trump. I think Donald Trump is an extremely important figure, not because of who he is, but because of what he is, what he represents, and how he can act as a catalyst. The change that I think we desperately need, and the kind of change we've been talking about for the last hour or so.
Well, let's hope, even though as true Brits who wish we could chart our own path and we didn't want to leave the European Union to end up in hop to America, in this case, we will look forward to our unofficial metropole in the hope that we can gain some kind of inspiration. Philip, it's been an absolute pleasure. I have really enjoyed this conversation, being able to talk about Blackadder and Oasis and Tomb Raider and the monarchy all in one fell swoop. Couldn't be as British. So thank you very much for coming on. I do hope we get to speak again in the future, and I wish you all the best in your life outside of academia. I'm sure you'll go from strength to strength and you'll get plenty more talking head spots, I'm sure. So thank you very much for making the time.
Thanks, John. It's been an absolute pleasure, and look forward to speaking to you soon.
To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel @ThinkingClass and follow me on X @ThinkingClasses. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.